Gaieties and gentlemen. This documentary will be talking about the importance and evolution of soul food for African Americans and how it is related to our culture. Soul food is a type of food forged from the years of slavery and oppression that the African Americans had to endure for hundreds of years. But there wouldn't be soul food if it wasn't for one of, if not the biggest atrocities ever committed against one single group of people. The transatlantic slave trade was a horrible 400 years for all the Africans that were involved in it. Tribes sold off other tribespeople, useless people in their own tribes, and anyone they didn't deem useful to white colonizers so that they could potentially save their own tribespeople, but sadly, it did not save them. The trading of people for weapons, food, and wine weren't enough to stop the colonizers from purging, raping, and pillaging that they would eventually do to these tribes that they once traded with. These tribes were decimated and wiped off the face of the earth, and the people taken as slaves onto slave ships. These slave ships had horrible conditions. The slaves were taken on board after being branded with hot irons and shackled to one another onto the lower decks where there was no space, bathrooms, or sanitation. Africans would get sick and die on a daily basis due to disease. The bodies of the deceased were thrown overboard into the Atlantic water. There were methods of revolt. Some Africans would jump off the boats into the water, drowning themselves. This specific method of resistance was so common that slave ships began to come with nets on the side so that the Africans couldn't jump into the water. Some other Africans would refuse to eat, attempting to starve themselves. The problem with this is that the captors on the ship would torture them and force the slaves to eat, which resulted in the slaves getting fed and didn't allow them to starve. Other slaves would just straight up revolt, coming together to attack and kill their captors and taking over the ship. The problem with this one, though, is that it didn't always work, and sadly resulted in the death of multiple Africans and the torture of all of those who attempted to revolt. Despite all these forms of resistance, most of the slaves made it to the Americas, where the injustice only began. The slaves that survived the trip were sent to auction houses. These auction houses were then separate mothers from their children and strip the slaves so that they could be examined by potential buyers. Buyers would auction against each other so that they can own these people as slaves and have them work on their plantations. After slaves were bought and brought to their plantations, they were met with horrible living and working conditions. Field slaves were slaves that worked in the field. They were fed whatever wasn't eaten by their masters and were only given 4 hours of sleep, all while being worked constantly in the hot sun, being yelled at and whipped at by overseers and sometimes the master themselves, and raped whenever the master wanted. During their horrible captivity under the watchful eyes of their new masters, they were only able to eat the leftovers of what their masters ate, and this was the beginning of soul food. The term soul food became popular in the 60s and 70s during the Black Power movement, but the food's roots were created back during slave times. All the food in the soul food culture came from the leftover and undesirable parts of any food that were given to the slaves, since their owners weren't going to eat them, on top of any foods that the slaves could hunt and gather. Despite these humble beginnings, soul food has climbed the ranks in the culinary world, going from slave food to gourmet food. Soul food started as being made from inexpensive and hunted foods such as pork, squirrel, turtles, frogs, corn, and seafood like crawfish, shellfish, and crabs. These foods are poverty foods, foods that are so low in the barrel that they are buried underneath it. But time is a powerful thing. As time went on, these foods became more and more wanted. It also propelled one food specifically even further into stardom due to how the slaves managed to optimize every part of this animal. The animal and food in question? Pigs, also known as pork. Pork played a massive role because it was the food that slaves managed to optimize the most. While only being given pig feet, lock, skin, intestines, and all the other undesirable parts of a pig, they managed to make wonderful dishes that, nowadays, have captured the hearts of U.S. citizens and people all over the world. Nowadays, we can make soul food using good ingredients so that we can make dishes like country smothered pork chops, easy seasoned pork chops, Carolina pulled pork, and many, many, many more. But back in the day, they didn't get the privilege to have things like pork chops, as they would end up getting eaten by the masters. Back during the slave days, slaves had to get unbelievably creative so that they could get every nutrient that they possibly could from the food that they were given, aka the leftovers. Slaves took all these foods and adapted them into new dishes. But the slave masters weren't the only people that highly influenced soul food. Native Americans, specifically southeastern Native Americans, also influenced the food that the slaves ate. One of the biggest parts of soul food that was given to them by the Native Americans was corn, or known as maize at the time. The Native Americans taught the slaves to also use a process called nixtamalization, which was used back in the day to create cornbread, which, as we strongly know today, was combined / assimilated into black culture so much that most people don't even know that cornbread was a food that was made by the natives and not by the people of color. All of these developments in soul food are super important because it reinforced how important soul food was in general. Soul food was unbelievably important to the survival of African American slaves, not just for health reasons, but because it gave them hope, a reason to live, and it replaced a culture that they lost due to the 100 years of oppression and slavery. Those meals derived from chitlins were a brief respite from the normal everyday pain that they would go through. After a while, soul food and slavery became their culture. After so much time, they lost their culture since they were unable to speak their own language, perform their own religious practices, and live peacefully. This way of life was all they knew, and the food they ate was all they ever tasted. They might have heard stories from those that remembered their homeland, but after a while, those would die out too, meaning the only culture that remained was the one right in front of them. These extreme conditions lasted hundreds of years until after the Union won the Civil War on one fateful day, December 6, 1865, where the 13th Amendment passed, making every slave in the country now free under national law. This was a big day in U.S. history because this meant that it was illegal to own slaves. They would finally be free from their masters. What followed this big achievement was a movement of former slaves called the Great Migration. The Great Migration was a massive migration of former slaves into the northern states. As they migrated to the northern states, they took their culture with them, spreading the southern slave culture further into the U.S. When these former slaves arrived in the northern parts of the country, some would work in white people's homes as cooks, since white people also began to love their food. This introduction of soul food into white homes began to create a foothold in the white community, and as time went on, the food began to spread throughout other cultures that lived in the U.S. Soul food became loved by all different types of people. During this time, soul food got its name since soul was the word used to describe the cooking techniques and ingredients used in this cooking method. Before these restaurants monetized soul food, they were being made and passed down by grandmas and grandpas who learned from their parents, since soul food is food that is passed down from generation to generation. It is food made from the heart and that feeds the soul. It has cuisines that are filled with culture and emotion. The creation and spread of soul food was wonderful, especially since it came from such a horrible and dark time in history. It was unbelievably important since it gave African Americans culture during a time where our culture was stripped from us and we were left feeling less than human. Soul food was one of, if not the most important culinary creation for African Americans, and it has propelled us forward despite our horrible circumstances. With that being said, this is the end of my documentary. I hope you enjoyed watching, as I enjoyed pulling my hair out making this video. Thank you for watching. Please give me a good grade.